Okay. Okay. Good afternoon. I'm very happy to have our Explorers event today on September 20th. And today we have two very special guests for me because they are my colleagues at Iona University. They are Nora Slominski and Michael Crowder. I am Jimena Perry. Let me introduce you to our guests today. Dr. Nora Slominski is the director of the Institute for Thomas Paine Institute. The Institute for Thomas Paine Studies at Iona University. She's an associate professor with appointments in the history department and the ITPS. She's the social media editor for the Journal of the Early Republic and a research associate at the McNeil Center for Early American Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. Her research focuses on the intersection of copyright, state formation, and information regulation in early America. Her research is supported by the Mellon Foundation, the Huntington Library, the American Antiquarian Society, and the Library Company of Philadelphia, among others. And also today we have with us Dr. Michael Crowder. Michael earned his PhD in the History Department at the Graduate Center, City University of New York. His project, Human Capital, The Moral and Political Economy of Northeastern Abolitionism, 1763-1833, examines the relationships between the rapid growth of abolitionism and capitalism in the era of the American Revolution. He has also written essays about the African colonization movement and American participation in the slave trade, as well as articles about American football for Rolling Stone. That's really impressive. In addition to serving as an archival fellow, he teaches American history at Queens College, CUNY. So Michael and Nora, thank you very much for being here. On behalf of the International Federation for Public History, I welcome you. The floor is all yours.
Thank you so much, Jimena, and thank you to the IFPH for having us. This is really exciting and wonderful to be here. So Michael and I, in our time today, are going to co-chair the presentation, and we're delighted to be able to share with you some information about the Institute for Thomas Paine Studies, or ITPS for short, and specifically focusing on the initiatives that we do around public history. So to get us started, we're going to break our conversation down into 3 key points. And the first of those is to share a little backstory about the founding and evolving mission of the ITPS, give you a little background about Thomas Paine and why the ITPS came into being around his complex legacy and contributions today. And then we're going to speak a little bit further about the connection between his life and legacies in the Age of Revolutions and how that really relates to methodologies, in public history and the ways in which we sort of experience history in our day-to-day life. And then we'll pick up with students and our student-centered efforts at public history, give you a sense of what's working for us, what we've had some challenges with, and next steps to really ensure that our students at Iona and any student around the country, around the world that we come into contact with or that is in our virtual and in-person communities have as much engagement with historical practice and opportunities that we can generate for them. Yeah. So Michael, did you want to add anything before I move on?
Hi, everybody. I'm sorry, I'm having some Zoom problems. No, I don't think so, Nora, but thank you very much, Jimena, for the introduction. And I think we should just dive in.
Okay, wonderful. All right, well, I am gonna start us off then with the logistics or the sort of institutional or structural background of the ITPS. So the ITPS was founded at Iona University in 2011. So we're coming up almost over 2 years. I guess we're on our 8th or 9th birthday now. I could do that math, but I probably should have done that math before we started speaking today. Hey, if I was better at math, maybe I'd be doing other things with my time. But Thomas Paine, in the last years of his life, lived in New Rochelle. He had what was then a farm right down the street, less than half a mile from Iona's main campus. And it's in part that connection between Payne, New Rochelle, and the Iona communities that prompted the ITPS to come into being at Iona when it did. The other part of that story, or the other part of why the ITPS came into being, in addition to that historical and personal connection, has to do with the Thomas Payne National Historical Association collection. Because I haven't given you enough acronyms already, here's one more, which is TPNHA. And the TPNHA is a more than 100-year-old historical association, also based in New Rochelle. And it was founded in the late 19th century, inspired, much like the ITPS, you can say, by the life and legacies of Thomas Paine. But whereas the ITPS is very much focused on a university setting, the TPNHA was really a activist political group. It was inspired by history and engaged very deeply with history, but was very much, or not but really, and was very much a left-wing, progressive, radical, even political group again. So they really used Paine as a way in which to inform their contributions and solutions to their contemporary moment. So one of the many things that they did was collect in many archival materials from Paine's life. And so you can see in the image in front of you just a few highlights of what that might look like. Thomas Paine's writing kit, for example, a early copy of perhaps his most famous work, Common Sense, a replica of his trunk, his pocket watch, which are all more of his personal effects, some effects that are a little bit more scandalous or controversial, a picture that we'll talk a little bit more about in a few minutes that was pretty critical of Thomas Paine. It was, I guess, the 18th century version of trolling Thomas Paine, if you will. As well as items from the TPNHA's work itself. So institutional minutes, institutional records, items that belong to active members. For example, one leading member of the organization was the first professional photographer. So we have hundreds of photographs from the late 19th century from people like Mark Twain on his deathbed, to the first professional, or one of the first known professional women swimmers in the United States. It was a really eclectic, interesting collection. So that's really the sort of founding mission of the ITPS. Since I came on board in 2017, we've been expanding our mission out, and Michael joined me as a colleague about 2 years later. And we've been working on, I would say, inspired by the kind of work that Paine did as a journalist, as a communicator, as someone who was himself very invested in history and historical knowledge. He was in his own way a public historian, writing for as broad a community as possible, for as many people as possible, as broad an audience. And those issues that he cared about, again, government, political justice, labor. He was very much concerned about working class and laboring people's issues and their survival and their well-being. From freedom of belief and expression, those are all historical subjects that we're interested in, and their contemporary connections, as well as taking as inclusive an approach as possible. So considering the histories and experiences of women of all background, enslaved and free African Americans, Indigenous Americans, immigrants, and other communities that are far less perhaps, or were not certainly as famous or recorded in that historical moment. And we approach this work in three key ways, and that's archival studies, digital humanities, and public history. And one of these examples of Paine in public history that I would just like to leave you with before I turn it over to Michael is this zoomed in image of a picture of Paine. And I really tried to make a pun of a picture of Paine work. And just had a little bit of challenges with somehow making that fit on a slide. But what you can see here is when Paine infamously stood trial for seditious libel in England, in absentia, in the 1790s. He was intermittently incarcerated in France in this time, as well as, again, avoiding prosecution for seditious libel for some of his more famous writings, we might say. In any event, this picture really doesn't like Paine. The artist of this picture really does not like him. And they depict him with his head on a serpent, calling him a meddler, and putting, basically sticking his nose into business does not apply to him. This is a very pro-monarch or pro-monarchy symbols as well and statements as well. And on the back, if you flip the picture around on days when you're feeling maybe less political or less fired up about how much Thomas Paine annoys you, you can turn it around and see a picture of very wealthy, well-dressed people ambling through the countryside. What makes this artifact, I think, so compelling from a public history perspective is that this is not an artifact owned by elites. This is an artifact that everyday folks would purchase, would have in their kitchen as a little bit of luxury. It's made of creamware. And it really is an item that shows how deeply politically engaged everyday people were in England and around the world, and the ways in which they were processing and contributing to the political realities around them. This picture, this tiny little inexpensive picture, somehow survives the 18th century and into the 19th century, makes its way all the way across the Atlantic Ocean, and winds up effectively as a pen holder for many years. It winds up as a sort of nondescript artifact in the TPNHA collection until members of the association were like, this is a significant historical artifact. We need to preserve it. And we need to let students look at it. We need to make sure that it's accessible to as wide an audience as possible. So hence the lovely photos you see in front of you, which are taken by our colleague in the library. The director of libraries, Rick Palladino, who's also a wonderful photographer. And I think that hopefully in a nutshell, or in a creamware, sums up some of the real stakes of what we're trying to do with the ITPS. And so with that, I will turn it over to Michael, who I should also note is working on a biography of Paine. And he can give you a little bit more background about Paine's publishing hits, his greatest hits, if you will, and a little bit more about the man himself.
Thanks so much, Nora, and thank you all for being here. I apologize if my angle is a little bit off, but my laptop decided to go wonky with Zoom, so I'm using my phone. I do want to build on what Nora said and sort of talk a little bit more about the archive itself. Nora, I love that picture so much. I think that's so cool. And aside from material objects, some of which I think, Nora, you might have mentioned, physical objects that Paine owned, like bifocals, as I adjust my own glasses, his writing kit, which I think we'll see an image of shortly, some of which we saw on the previous slide. In some ways, the core of the collection is early editions of Paine's greatest publishing hits. And Nora, you did mention the TPNHA and the sort of individual, if there were one, that was the driving force behind both the creation of the TPNHA, but also was the driving collecting force behind it, was a man named Moncure Conway, who was born before the Civil War and was born to a prominent slaveholding family, which he turned against and became an abolitionist during the Civil War, just before the Civil War, and then afterward. And he spent much of the rest of his life promoting the legacy of Thomas Paine. And he was the person that physically purchased, or remotely purchased, but physically collected much of the bulk of the items in our collection at the ITPS. And these are just three of Paine's greatest publishing hits. And Nora, you've already mentioned some of the key points about Thomas Paine, so I don't want to repeat you too much, but I think it is fair to say that if we can use an anachronistic term, progressive, which didn't exist in the 18th and early 19th century, I think it is fair to say that amongst the thought leaders and certainly the political leaders of the founding generation of the United States, Paine deserves to be called the most progressive of them all. And we can kind of get a sense of that from these images, which I took a couple of years ago from our collection. On the left, as you can see, is Common Sense. I think that's probably the best known of Paine's works. That and the first line of his American Crisis pamphlet, which you can't see here, from December of 1776, in which he said, "These are the times that try men's souls." But the image that you see on the left is an early edition of Common Sense we have in the collection, printed in New York City, which you can't see from the bottom because it's cropped. So this was published within 3 to 4 months after Common Sense was originally published in Philadelphia. And of course, in this pamphlet, Paine made the forceful argument that the 13 North American colonies, not including Canada, needed to declare independence immediately from Great Britain, that it was common sense to do so. And this vaulted him to fame, and as Nora, you also mentioned infamy, because you did mention that that we have quite a few objects that are negative expressions against pain from the late 18th and early 19th centuries, including the picture that you showed. We also have some commemorative coins that literally have imprints that were made in the 1790s of Thomas Paine being hanged, an effigy of Thomas Paine being hanged on the back on one side of a commemorative coin. But common sense was the starting point for much of his early career. And when I say early career, I think I should point out as well that Thomas Paine didn't move to North America until the end of 1774. He was originally born in England and worked as a tax collector, amongst many other things, an excise officer. So I say his early career, but he was already a mature man by the time he began to gain notoriety, positive or negative notoriety, both actually. And so common sense, that's a beautiful early edition that we have, and actually one of the few that I've seen that's in as good a shape as it's in. But if we fast forward to 1791, 1792, the middle image is that of Rights of Man. Nora, you did mention Rights of Man as the book that got him tried in absentia and sentenced to death by the British Empire, the British government, for seditious libel, as you mentioned. And what you can see here is a very, very early printing of the second part of Rights of Man. It was published in two parts, the first in 1791, the second in 1792. If you can see the small text at the bottom, this is a printing from London by H.D. Symonds, if I'm saying that correctly. Nora, you're the publishing history person. I think I'm saying that correctly, Symonds or Simons. And that's really awesome too. And Rights of Man is really what vaulted Thomas Paine into the notoriety of his later life. Nora, you did mention that he left England to move to France at the height of the French Revolutionary period in 1792, in part to escape prosecution for seditious libel. Because Rights of Man had a very straightforward message, which is that very much fits in with Paine's thought over the course of his life, which is that monarchies and hereditary aristocracies are illegitimate in terms of thinking about the Enlightenment principles of natural rights. In other words, that no individual in the form of a king or a queen or a group of individuals in the form of hereditary aristocrats had a natural right to superiority, to social, legal, economic, and cultural superiority. Therefore, monarchies are illegitimate, as are hereditary aristocracies. And this brought him into the attention of French revolutionaries, who invited him to come and participate and, in fact, serve as a member of the Constituent Assembly in 1792 and 1793 at the height of the French Revolution. And as you mentioned, Nora, he was then jailed during the Reign of Terror, provoked by Maximilien Robespierre, who jailed a great many people and executed a great many people. And so that's outside of the United States, I would say Thomas Paine is much more known for Rights of Man, I think, than Common Sense. And the final image you can see on the right is an early printing, a New York printing of Age of Reason. Also published in 2 volumes in 1794 and 1795, building off of the arguments that Thomas Paine made in Rights of Man, but using those arguments against the illegitimacy of hereditary privilege, but applying them to organized religion. And between Rights of Man and Age of Reason, Thomas Paine found himself running afoul of authorities and also public opinion, both in Great Britain, in France for political reasons, but also in the United States. Thomas Paine lost a lot of people who, and I'll just name a couple of names, somebody like John Adams, for example, who never loved Thomas Paine, but respected his thinking. A lot of people, trying to think of the best way to put this, dumped Thomas Paine as somebody that they had respect for, or were known associates of, because of Age of Reason. And so these are some of his greatest hits. We don't see another one here, and I think we might have in a subsequent slide, which is my favorite, which is Agrarian Justice. But these are just some selections from our archive.
And Michael, I don't know if you have access to the PowerPoint. Would you like me to move the slide for you to the next one?
I think you need to, if you don't
Oh,
mind, Nora.
sure, no problem. So Michael will continue sharing a little bit more about Payne's controversy and conflict. So this will help set up why he's relevant today. So I'll turn it over or back to Michael to talk about the influence of Payne's ideas.
Thank you very much, Nora. And we've already presaged some of the bullet points to the left, and I just mentioned agrarian justice. Payne's least known pamphlet from 1796, but in agrarian justice and in other works like Rights of Man and Age of Reason in particular, Common Sense too, to an extent. Payne made such forceful arguments against long-established institutions and long-established politico, legal, social classes that, excuse me, cumulatively, Payne is probably the most probably the most polarizing, or at least to me, the most polarizing figure of the founding generation. We've touched upon the first point there, that Payne had a very strong interest in an anti-entrenched privilege argument, which is what we call it here. And some of that is because Payne, as you might suspect, did not come from a background of privilege in England, which is to say that he did not come from hereditary aristocracy or the gentry, or even the upper middle class bourgeois classes of England. He grew up in, I think, what is usually described as, and I certainly agree with this, as a lower middle class to middle class background. And many of his biographers, going back to the 19th century, have made the point that his background very much influenced his anti-entrenched privilege argument. And the entrenched privileges that Payne argued against were pretty much everyone you could find, all the way from monarchs and hereditary aristocrats down to churches, organized religion, whether it was Catholic or Protestant, frankly. And if we were to categorize Payne's political thought, it would be small r republicanism, which we can see in the third point there. That's a major point that he developed beginning with Common Sense. And actually, according to some of my research, which has yet to be published, he began developing arguments before Common Sense, before he wrote Common Sense earlier in the 1770s, through writings that have yet to be definitively attributed to him. But Payne's core theme, I believe, is the third point, is small r republicanism, the 18th century, for the time, radical political philosophy that the people, quote unquote, meaning people who were not born into privilege simply because of the parentage of their birth, that the people can govern themselves. In other words, did not need to be governed by monarchs, did not need to be governed by entrenched privileges in the form of a hereditary aristocracy, if I can speak correctly. And so, in other words, Payne was very interested in empowering common people. And the image on the right, I think, is really, really fascinating, and I think kind of connects to this point and to something, Nora, you mentioned earlier. So I'd like to explain it just a little bit. So the image you see on the right is not from Agrarian Justice. It's actually from a copy of Common Sense that we have in the collection, which was published in Newburyport, Massachusetts in 1776. So a relatively small town, which probably only had one printing press, maybe two. And this is a fantastic copy. But what's most fantastic about it is that, and I'll never forget when I first looked through this copy, I was flipping through it and sort of just trying to get a feel for any kind of marginalia. And I flipped all the way to the very back page, which is what you can see on the right there. And I was just looking at it, and I realized what I was looking at. I was looking at a husband and wife, and you can sort of see their names. The first two words are Benjamin Fulke, which is Fulke. And then below the line, you can see Hannah Fulke, who we believe was his wife. There's next to nothing known about this couple. So in other words, they were common people. Benjamin likely worked in seafaring trades of some kind. Hannah was his wife. But what's fascinating, and this says a lot about both Common Sense, but also Thomas Paine, was that this couple purchased a copy of Common Sense and not only seemed to have read it, and imbibed its arguments, and therefore sort of imbibed the small R Republican philosophy that Thomas Paine offered in Common Sense. But they also use it as a way to the blank end paper as a way to practice their own writing skills, which is what you can see on this in this image on the right. And it's sort of hard to read, but it's basically Benjamin Folk starts out and it says, this is Benjamin Folk's book, not only to read, but to write in, because learning is better than houses or land. Amen, amen, amen. So it's a sort of homily to himself, but in the form of a writing lesson. And then Hannah Folk below the line continues, Hannah Folk her hand, meaning this is now Hannah Folk writing. And then you can sort of try to, I'm not going to read the entire thing for you, but it's just fascinating to me that common people took both the ideas of common sense seriously, but that they thought that it would, like, somehow in the reading and consumption context of common sense, thought that it would be the perfect vehicle or a vehicle for them to practice their own learning and their own education. And as Nora, you mentioned earlier, this was a priority for Thomas Paine. In the introduction, you mentioned this was a priority for Thomas Paine, promoting the interests of common people, promoting education, promoting access to information through his journalism. And so I think this is one of the most interesting pieces in the collection to me. In Agrarian Justice there, speaking of empowering common people, is published in the year 1796. And in this, Thomas Paine argues, makes one of his only systematic and extensive political economic arguments in terms of his plans for organizing political economy to benefit the quote unquote common people as much as possible. And so agrarian justice, as you can see, as opposed to agrarian law, into agrarian monopoly, by which he meant the monopolizing of land owning by a very small number of people. In this, and you can see, if you look at the middle of the image, you see the term a national fund. Thomas Paine promoted the first, what we might call, social security scheme. I don't think he was the very first person to have this idea. I know that there are some antecedents, but this is one of the first pamphlets that systematically laid out an idea for what we would today call social security, how that might work. And in effect, and this also touches upon his interest in his interest in not subordinating women economically and politically. If you look closely, he specifically says that this is a plan that should apply to both men and women. In this plan, in his schema, there should be a national fund that would be drawn from taxes on the largest landholders, and that fund would be used to pay men and women when they turned 18 £10 so that they could start their life out. And in his mind, that meant providing what we would, I guess, today call a down payment on a farm to establish family farms. And then at the age of 50, provide for what today we would call Social Security out of the same fund. And this idea was radical for its time. As I mentioned, it wasn't, I don't think that he created it sui generis. I know that there are other people who had floated the idea, but this is one of my favorite of his works. And I like to pair these two images together, even though they're from different works, for that reason, because I think they exemplify his focus on the belief that political economy should be shifted towards the interests of common people rather than continue to benefit entrenched people in entrenched privilege. And I skipped over it, but I'll mention it briefly because I know that I can't talk all the time about Paine as much as I would like to. Another hallmark of Paine's thought is his anti-slavery beliefs. And unfortunately for Paine's scholars, he did not sit down for many reasons, some of which I believe I know and some of which are lost to time. Paine did not sit down and write an extensive systematic work explaining why he was and why he believed slavery was wrong and the steps that could be taken to ameliorate it. But it's very clear from his writings, and it's very clear from letters that he wrote, writings in which he referred to slavery, and from a couple of letters that he wrote to acquaintances, that Paine was an ardent critic and opponent of chattel slavery wherever it existed, and as well as the slave trade, which fed the slave societies of the Americas. So Nora, I think back to you.
Yeah, so thanks, Mike. So what I think is also really a significant takeaway here, especially as we pivot now perhaps more to what we can describe as the student-focused and public memory components of pain and the work that we do with the ITPS, is that quote, founding fathers to this day occupy a tremendous amount of attention, right, in the United States. And part of that has to do with the extensive documentation we have about their lives, the undoubted influence they had on the formation of national government, right? The Constitution is still in existence, federalism, and so on and so forth. But what Paine allows us to do, and Paine was undoubtedly a very famed figure in his lifetime and continues to be someone who is very much remembered. I want to be very clear about that. He is not obscure. Paine provides a lens or a window into thinking about people who get far less attention. Paine's writing and his belief system allow us to consider the ways in which, when we commemorate the founding era, when we think about the memory of the sort of founding of the United States, how do we tell a more complicated story, a more nuanced story? And if perhaps most centrally, how do we better understand the impact, of those complexities on our current moment? So I will turn it back to Michael just to run through where Paine kind of stands in proximity to some of these other figures briefly, and then from there we're going to move ourselves firmly into the present day.
Thanks, Nora. And I'll just touch upon a couple of these points somewhat briefly, because I know we have more that we'd love to share. But that your comments there were a great segue into talking about where Paine sits in the pantheon, if you will, of the founding generation, but certainly its intellectual thought leaders and its political leaders. And the first point is a way of restating, Nora, what you just mentioned, which is that when we look at the founding generation, and we as historians, and certainly when we assess their beliefs and try to, and then therefore assess and interpret the influence of their beliefs, there's often an instinct to think about the founding generation as one that promoted concepts that we'd call democracy today, and that's not necessarily correct. But if there's one founder that did, or founding figure, I should say, that did express ideas that are that we would call small d democratic today, they were Thomas Paine, and some of the reasons for that are I explained on the previous slide. But what's fascinating, and this is the next couple of points, is that Paine both knew and was friends, but also became enemies with some of the other very, very well-known founding figures. Paine and Jefferson are a fascinating duo to consider, because they knew each other going back to 1776, when Thomas Jefferson was serving as a member of the Continental Congress and on the committee which created the American Declaration of Independence. And what's interesting about the frenemies with benefits, as we call them here, Thomas Paine and Thomas Jefferson, or the two Tommies, as I think about them in my head all the time, is that they shared so many similar beliefs, and yet they came from completely different backgrounds. Thomas Paine, born, as I mentioned, lower to middle class, depending on the parlance of our times. Meanwhile, Thomas Jefferson being born the son of a wealthy enslaver from Virginia, and spending his entire life as a wealthy enslaver. They were frenemies because they were friends, I should say, because they did share many of the same core ideals. We could certainly call them both small R Republicans. And in many different venues, they each expressed critiques of monarchies and critiques of hereditary aristocracy. And yet, by the end of Paine's life, Paine died before Thomas Jefferson, they had become enemies. And the reason they became enemies is not the usual reason that Paine became enemies with people, which is typically based on the arguments in The Rights of Man, but especially the Age of Reason, the anti-organized religion text that Paine wrote, mostly because Jefferson shared the views that were critical of organized religion. But they became enemies for political reasons, even though they were very sympathetic in terms. There were a lot of similarities and commonalities. That's the term I should use, between their thinking. If we pivot to look at somebody completely different, John Adams, who is famously Thomas Jefferson's most consistent correspondent over the course of about 40 years. And if I remember correctly, they died on the same day in 1822. Paine and John Adams are a completely different and really interesting pairing. John Adams despised Paine's writing, thought that it was hackneyed. He believed that it was unsophisticated. I personally think that John Adams was jealous of the fame and the infamy that Paine's writing generated. And yet, even John Adams, who in 1776 was so upset that somebody thought he wrote Common Sense, that he wrote streams of letters just to remind people that he did not write Common Sense, which was originally published anonymously. But by the end of his life, John Adams said this, and he does not necessarily mean this positively or negatively, but he was assessing the history of the previous 50 years in the 1820s, which encompassed what we today call the Age of Revolutions, the age of revolutions, which began with the American Revolution and then spread to France and to other parts of Europe, encompassing the Haitian Revolution, and then ending with the Latin American revolutions of the 18 teens and 20s. When John Adams, as an old man, thought back over chains of events that were global in scope, and he assessed both his role and the role of Thomas Paine, he said with sarcasm, this must have been the age of Paine, because Paine helped to, through his writings, unleash popular unrest against entrenched privilege that John Adams was very critical of. In other words, to hark back to the first point, John Adams was no fan of democracy. And he believed that Thomas Paine had done something very dangerous to the world by unleashing inspiring democratic political participation. Let's look at a third figure, Paine and Washington, George Washington. Paine had met George Washington in 1776, and they were quite close to each other, to the point that if I've been getting my year correct, in early 1777, it seems as though from one of the few letters that Paine wrote that survived, he invited George Washington over to his house while the Continental Army was campaigning in Pennsylvania for a crust of bread, some cheese, and some oysters. So they were close enough that they were making dinner dates with each other, which seemed to have happened. Washington recognized Paine's utility, certainly as the author of Common Sense, but also as the author of the American Crisis Essays, which served to boost the morale of the rebel or American patriot army in particular, but in terms of public opinion, in late 1776 and early 1777, at a time that it was not clear whether or not the military aspect of the war for independence would succeed at all. And I'm going to leave the last point to you, Nora, because you know more about Hamilton than I do. But I do want to just mention, especially the image on the bottom there, and this is interesting because it's not the usual depiction of the pantheon of members of the founding generation, because this is from the year 1895. It's from a publication called The Truth Seeker, which was closely connected to the TPNHA, which Nora discussed earlier. This was a free thinking or free thought periodical, as were many of the early members of the TPNHA, which means that it was specifically anti-organized religion. And they held Paine up as as you can see from the image, as their preferred member of the founding generation. And it's very rare to see Thomas Paine being crowned with the laurel of wreaths by the feminine symbol of the United States, Columbia, there, while Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, and Benjamin Franklin, of all people, stand watching quietly, observing Thomas Paine being crowned as the true leader of the American Revolution. And I should mention Thomas Paine owed much of his career to Benjamin Franklin very early on through Benjamin Franklin's support. So it's even stranger to see Benjamin Franklin uh, not bowing, but paying respect to Thomas Paine, because in reality, that would have been the exact opposite. But to make a political point in the late 19th century, I love this image, and I think it's so much fun to look at, and it makes us think about historical memory. And in this case, how did certain people in the late 19th century remember Thomas Paine? And I'll let you address Hamilton.
Sure. Well, I think that point of historical memory is what's really key here. And again, to tie back to the theme of our talk, which is public history in action, right? That the way in which the ITPS sees the work that we do is very much in the vein of applied history, right? That's very much oriented towards a focus on connecting what is, and to be very clear, it is incredibly important to study history for history's sake, right? Whatever knowledge is interesting or germane to you is terrific. But in this case, what I think when I look at this image, what it really drums home or really makes clear to me is the ways in which these events of the past, these perceptions of the past, continue to frame so much of how people around the world today are grappling with those legacies. And what makes Paine and Hamilton such an interesting contrast is, of these famed figures of the late 18th century, these quote founding fathers, in terms of the circumstances of their birth, they are probably the two that have the most in common, in the sense of they both come from the most humble of circumstances. Hamilton arguably even more humble than that of Paine. Paine is born the son of a corset maker or stay maker, which is a tradescraft, right, in England at the time, and his of a Quaker and Anglican household. His parents were of different faiths, but he grew up Quaker. Again, modest means. Hamilton, infamously, unfairly infamously, grew up with a single mother. He grew up in a quote, an illegitimate household where he was raised by his mother, and had access to education. His mother at one point may have had more financial resources, but they certainly lived in a quote hand-to-mouth manner. There was these connections amongst these figures that grow to such tremendous influence. And yet the ways in which Paine sees the solutions to the problems of the world, the way in which Hamilton sees the solutions to the problem of the world, have historically been seen as quite different. And yet the progressives, as much as we can even use that term, right, as a very wide range, a really big umbrella in the late 19th century of people, right, who believed, if one thing they had in common was that government should be an active participant in making people's lives better. In that sense, they both saw something in Paine and Hamilton that was relevant to them in their moment. In a way that they did not necessarily see the same thing of Jefferson or Washington or Franklin. The people who saw relevance in Washington, in fact, were people, were the daughters of the Confederacy, right? Were people with very different politics. But the ones who saw something usable, for lack of a better term, in Hamilton, in that generation, were both Hamilton and Paine. And that is interesting, right? Why do people in different historical moments see something about the past that speaks to them? What is the source of that connection? And that's been really critical in the work that we're doing. We spent the last nearly 40 minutes talking to you about Thomas Paine very specifically, talking to you about one famous individual from the late 18th century. But the work of the ITPS builds off of the legibility, right? The knowledge that people have of Paine, in order to get at much broader, much more expansive historical realities, historical circumstances, historical connections, and bring that into our present day. And the term I have on the slide in front of us, and I grappled with this as I was putting this together, is parallels necessarily the right word? And right now, and I think there's a few students from this class who are with us today, but I'm teaching a class called Timeless Issues in History. And one of the themes that we're thinking about in that class, I know Yumena is familiar with it, right, is the tension between change over time, which, as public historians, public history as its own academic discipline, public history as a source of scholarship and research, public history as history in the quote broader world, right? How history is lived and experienced, all these different ways of practicing history. We all observe that change over time is inevitable, right? There is change, and not inevitable that change is necessarily going to be good or in the sort of Whiggish march towards progress, but that it's going to simply be different, right? That change over time will happen, occur, and yet in tension with change over time is timelessness, is these connections that we see. And over the last few years with the ITPS, Michael and I have observed what I would qualify as sort of three big categories of connection. The work that Payne did, the communities that Payne moved through, the people who connected with him in his work, the people that he personally connected with. And I do really want to take a moment here to emphasize that while most of these founding era figures will fall very short of what we would hope in our present moment for democratic ideals and inclusivity to look like. There was a connection felt in this time and in this moment. The perspectives of women of all backgrounds, free and enslaved women, working class women, elite women, indigenous people, from multiple different nations and communities, enslaved and African and free people of color. These are all communities that are engaging with the issues in front of us right now, or in the slide in front of us. These are not issues exclusive to Payne. They are issues that were the challenges of the moment. And I think in many respects, they're also challenges of our moment. So Michael is gonna is gonna look at both the contemporary politics and civics component, as well as the commemoration historical memory, and I will pick up with media literacies and education. So back to Michael for those first two blocks.
Thanks, Nora. And I'm cognizant, I'll try to keep my comments relatively brief because I'm cognizant that we're running up close to time. But I think I'll just say that, Payne is undergoing a resurgence, and I would say this is true over the last 20 years. In interest by, as you can see in the first point, interest in Payne is growing amongst political liberals and leftists, and there's a lot of sort of overlap between those two, which we don't need to get into a discussion about distinguishing them. But he's once again rising in esteem as an example, much like he did in the late 19th century and early 20th centuries. And in some ways, there are parallels. Not that history is repeating itself to questions of political economy that were relevant in the early 20th century that are, I think, reemerging in different forms in our own time. And I think that's one reason why Payne's becoming more interesting to modern day political liberals and leftists. And the second point, it's fascinating to see how many politicians in particular will refer to Payne and in what contexts they do it. I'll start with a third name, Andrew Yang. Do we remember Andrew Yang from the 2020 election? And I suppose the governor's election of New York State. I think it's fair to say ultimately a fringe candidate, but who, without knowing a ton about Thomas Paine or having a bunch of deep knowledge about Thomas Paine, attempted to capitalize on Thomas Paine's leftist / progressive / liberal credentials by staking his campaigns around sorry, I've been talking all day. What is the word I'm looking for? The term I'm looking for. It is this not on the screen? I'm sorry, everybody. Wealth redistribution through taxes. And it was an unsuccessful campaign, but we see people as different as you can see Bernie Sanders, Nancy Pelosi, and we don't mention them here, but even conservative politicians had a brief moment with Thomas Paine in the 1990s, usually without having read much of his work or being able to understand it or contextualizing it. And the implications of this are interesting, and there's no law of Paine that says only people who consider themselves on the political left and or liberal are the only people who can appropriate Paine, but that seems to be the historical trend for reasons that we tried to, Nora and I both tried to explain earlier. In terms of commemoration and historical memory, I mean, the questions are I'll spend the rest of my life asking myself, why do we commemorate? Part of it's the human condition, but the second question I think is most sort of relevant to our own time is why does it matter who we choose to commemorate? And I think many of us here are aware of the statue controversies, especially since 2016. The taking down of Confederate statues in the former Confederate states, the taking down of statues that commemorate people in New York City, for example, the doctor who was once considered a pioneer in the field of gynecology, but it was exposed, pioneered his gynecological techniques through on enslaved women who had no right to object to his experiments, if you will. And what's interesting about this is that there's a surprisingly few number of statues in the United States, at least, that commemorate Thomas Paine. There are far more in Britain, but there will be one soon, hopefully in the next 2 years, on the National Mall in Washington, D.C. There's an organization that we're connected with, the ITPS, called the Thomas Paine Memorial Association, which has received approval to build to erect, I should say, a statue of Thomas Paine. But all of this is to say, and I'll wrap up my comments and kick it back to you, Nora, that one of the reasons I think that Thomas Paine is sort of rising again in esteem, not amongst historians, and especially academic historians themselves, and not even just amongst public historians like myself, but amongst the sort of general population as a whole, is because I think that there's a sense that only seeing the American Revolution, but especially interpreting the results of the American Revolution through the eyes of a relatively small number of famous founders like Thomas Jefferson, like George Washington, or even John Adams, limits the scope of people that we can recognize, that we should recognize as having had major roles to play in the foundation of the United States. And this is in particular marginalized voices. And if there is one person, and I'll be more specific, one white man in that time period who was willing to stand up for what today we'll call marginalized voices, that's Paine. And so I think that's one reason why there is interest in Paine, and why I am glad that there will be a Paine statue, and all of these debates are connected to the ongoing Revolutionary 250, as you can see the dates leading up to beginning in 2026 with the 250th commemoration of the Declaration of Independence. These ongoing efforts, I think it is very important who we choose to commemorate and who we don't, because when we commemorate, we're not necessarily making comments about the past, but we're making comments about the present by using the past to tell the story of what's happening to us now. And I think that's why Paine deserves, in my mind, more commemoration. I know I sound like a Paine fanatic, but you know what? I kind of am. So Nora, I'll kick it back to you.
Yeah. So moving, taking that into account, right? That commemoration and memory and how we remember the past speaks as much about historical evidence as it does our current moment, and broadening out from Paine, right? Thinking more about Paine's world and the other people who lived in it. What I think is also very important to bear in mind as public historians is these dual questions and interrelated questions of media literacies and education. It's a constantly changing digital landscape, right? We're speaking to each other maybe around the world right through Zoom right now. And media and information literacy, I think, is imperative in a way to understand for our students and for ourselves what we are reading that is accurate, what we are reading that is legitimate, what we are engaging with that is truthful and vetted. And on the one hand, like the incredibly democratic potentials of the internet, which are of course in turn limited by the economics of access, and as well as sort of the other challenges that we faced in recent years about how do you know when something's true or not. I think these are questions that in the late 18th century were very much on top of mind. And the reality that media literacy was critical to a functional democracy of any form was very well understood, right? And if you take that into are another challenging moment, which is, of course, many of the issues across higher education, and indeed for history educators from the pre through 12 level, right, of censorship and challenges in teaching about complex histories, be those histories of slavery and race or gender, the challenges that educators are facing around the United States in doing that work, as well as the challenges faced by higher education. To give a recent example, the difficulties faced by West Virginia University, and that's one of many examples. And these are concerns that, if we think about the importance of learning and education, or at the very least the availability of it to as wide and as many communities as possible, that strikes me as an essential intersection between the mission of public history in its many diverse forms and the ways in which we can understand the concerns that Paine and others like him had in the late 18th century as well. And so this then brings us to the more nitty gritty, the more specific details of how we at the ITPS try explicitly to, and I know we haven't talked quite as much about digital humanities over the course of our talk than perhaps we should have, perhaps because digital humanities is just so incredibly ubiquitous in everything that we're doing. At minimum, digital history is omnipresent in everything that we do with the ITPS, precisely because those questions about media literacy and accessibility are so very central to our work. And we do see public and digital history as being deeply intertwined. And I should say from the beginning that part of how we put these principles into practice, or how we put public and digital history into action, is by taking a very broad, big tent approach to what counts as DH. There, of course, like in any disciplines, there are deliberations about what might qualify. And in our case, we really take this as simply as possible. The conversation between computational tools and strategies, and again, in conversation with topics, debates, and tensions in the humanities, and really emphasizing to our students in particular, and in the scholarly research we produce, about how digital and data humanities, what they can do both for intellectual and pre-professional development for our students. In other words, what the humanities, particularly when approached through a digital or data-based method, how can that help you both grow as a intellectually curious and civically minded member of the Iona community, and also how can it help you get a job, right? That those are two intertwined entities, right? They're not separate, and they're both very important. And just to give you a few examples of that kind of work that we're doing, where students have been deeply involved in each of these, which is incredibly exciting. The first example is we're almost completed a extensive database of the TPNHA collection. So those artifacts that we started our talk off with, and are now, as we're wrapping up, those artifacts will soon be digitized, and hopefully many will be available via a virtual exhibit and a virtual museum, virtual curation, but at least the database is almost there, and that will allow researchers from all over the world to get a better sense of what we have in that collection, how it might be relevant for their own work. The second is a forthcoming open access, again in that spirit of Paine and accessibility, thanks to the Gardner Foundation and the support of Cornell University Press. The ITPS is publishing an edited collection called American Revolutions in the Digital Age. It will be available next August as its publication date, so please look out for it. It's freely available, and that contains has student contributors in that volume as well. And then we've also had the ongoing initiative of the Text Attribution Project, which is a collaboration with our colleagues in the computer science department here at Iona, and it involves the ongoing efforts to attribute currently anonymous or pseudonymous, texts from the late 18th century, so we can better understand what connections those might have to our present day. Michael, would you like to take the public history portion of this?
I will, and I'll try to be brief. And I'm also going to apologize for a repetition in the third point on the public history side. There's a typo, but I'll just build on what you said, Nora. That one of the priorities when we look at public and digital history, and especially as we practice it here at Iona University and with the ITPS, and with specific reference to student participation. It's very important for us to take public history, which, as you mentioned, Nora, we have the broadest possible definition of. I tried to brainstorm just 5 different kinds of public history, and in the second bullet point there, I could have sat down for an hour and come up with many, many, many more, from museum exhibitions to public commemorations, which can take the form of statues, but also the form of events, anniversary events, for example, music and theater performance, which we are developing in very musical performance for spring 2024. Keep your eye out for that. Social media, street art. I mean, you go on and on and on down the list, and we really hope to empower students and encourage them to take these relatively new disciplines. Public history is older chronologically than digital history, but they're both less than a century old, and they're both emergent. And how can we help students leverage experience to, as you mentioned earlier, Nora, to pre-professional ends, and in addition to academic ends, and the ways in which historical knowledge is translated. And I guess I'll leave with 2 points. One of the ways we do that is through several fantastic internship opportunities that are under the umbrella of our, thank you. Can you flip back to that, Nora? Under the umbrella of our public history and digital humanities minor degree at Iona College. We can certainly provide more information about that. And it's a unique program, which gives students both academic training, but also practical hands-on experience. And if you don't mind going back, Nora, the last thing I'll say will not actually be me, but one of my sort of recent projects that I feel like I'm too old to be qualified for is making TikTok videos of student interns, and we're starting a series called In the Vault. And can you click on that, please, Nora? Because I think it's an interesting way of bringing together archives, public history, and digital humanities and social media, if it does work. And if it doesn't work, I won't ruin the surprise of who it is soundtracked by.
If you can give me 1 second, I'm going to stop sharing. I'm going to open up a new window so we can play the video. Just give me 1 second.
Thank you. Sorry to just put you on the spot there, Nora.
No, it's okay. It's okay. Just hold that thought. And I will stop the share and I will move over to here. Okay. Okay. Unmute and begin. All right, here we go.
Hi, I'm Charlie. I'm a history student here at Iona University. We're going to take a look in the vault. Come on in. We're here with the Institute for Thomas Paine Studies. And right off the bat, we're going to throw our gloves on and take a look at some early American works. We have an early printing of Common Sense by Thomas Paine. Next to it, a letter from Thomas Paine to President George Washington, 1796. And we also have the signature of the original owner on the cover, very cool. And the last thing, one of my favorites here, is the early printing of Rights of Man by Thomas Paine. And again, we're here with the Institute for Thomas Paine Studies at Iona University, great stewards of American history.
Well, with any luck, Taylor Swift will get wind of it and come join us for our next next event. So that would be terrific. Okay, here we go. All right, so I can take it from here then. Well, the note we really want to wrap up on, and thank you for your patience, I know we've gone a few minutes over, is really emphasizing the student opportunities and that they are not just for history majors. And for that matter, not only for Iona students as well. If there happen to be students around the country, around the world, who see this talk at some point, please feel free to reach out to itps@iona.edu at any point. We would love to support and engage with you and your work and in any capacity. And, you know, Jimena and I, Dr. Perry and I, have been considering other opportunities, of course, for more global connections between the ITPS, the Iona History Department, and those options. But for now, you do not have to be a history major to participate in any of the offerings at the ITPS. As Michael, as Dr. Crowder already referenced, launched last year, so it's now going into its second year. We have a really phenomenal new program, a minor specifically at the ITPS, called Public History and Digital Humanities. And it's to minor at Iona, there's only a few courses you have to take, and there's probably a good chance it's overlapping with some of the ones you've already taken. But of the 2 classes you are required to take for this minor, one is an internship, one is an applied learning experience, which you take with Dr. Crowder. And Dr. Crowder in a moment will speak with you just about a few more of those on-site partners and ways in which you can internship. But part of the details I would love to share with you all is that the goal of the PhDH minor for short, or Public History and Digital Humanities, something we observed over the last few years and something we wanted to really shift, was demonstrating some students who were like, oh, we love history, we're really interested in it, but how is this going to help me get a job, right? How is this going to help me in my life after university, which is a completely valid perspective. So this program is really oriented around how do we take what is interesting and compelling and relevant above all about the humanities in general, but history, and apply that to what your major is, to whether it's nursing or physical therapy or accounting or biology or speech pathology, whatever, communications, media and strategic communications, whatever it might be. The digital humanities and data humanities and public history are going to be really helpful in preparing you for a career in those fields. And the Introduction to Public History and Digital Humanities course is going to help make that clear as to why. And so I'd love to now turn it over back to Michael for just a few minutes, and I can pick back up on the scholarly research portion if Michael can talk a little bit about the internship opportunities we have, both paid and for credit.
I certainly can. Thank you. So for credit, we have multiple collaborations with different organizations outside of Iona, some nearby in the New Rochelle community and some far away. And we're always developing more, but we're currently, in particular, proud of our collaboration with Mount Vernon, which is not the Mount Vernon that is close to New Rochelle, but George Washington's Mount Vernon in Virginia, which is a wonderful institution, one of the most well-respected historical organizations in the country, in which we're working on a variety of projects. And over the last couple of semesters, have been working with an archive of early American music manuscripts of about 13,000. So getting interns hands-on experience with creating metadata and being a significant part of the construction of what will be the largest archive of manuscripts of tunes, which is to say song manuscripts, mostly sheet music, from the late 18th and early 19th centuries. And as I mentioned, that's 13,000 songs. And we've had about a dozen interns work on that project. And Dr. Salimsky, you don't know this yet, but we're starting a new project this fall with Mount Vernon as well. Similar to the work with the Colonial Music Institute, but slightly different. We're also developing internship collaborations with the Westchester County Historical Society, much more close to home. And we hope to resume our collaboration with the Thomas Paine Cottage Museum, which was brought up at the very beginning of this talk by Dr. Salimsky, which is on hiatus because of damage from Hurricane Ida way back in 2020. And that's even more local. So the purpose of these is to allow students to get a wide array of experiential learning time in both digital humanities projects. And this does begin with learning the nuts and bolts of how do we create digital archives? How do we archive materials in a way that makes sense for a digital world? In addition to more sort of, I don't want to say traditional, it makes it sound boring, but more sort of more traditional type of public history, on-site public history type of experiences. So we're very excited about all of these, and there will always be more internship collaborations emerging certainly over the next year.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah, it's again, these are internships that I hope are compelling, and please reach out at any point if we can explain in further detail what these opportunities might provide for you in your own journey and in your own pre-professional development. For those who are more interested in the research side of things, and to be very clear, all of our internships do have a research component, but what I might describe as more, quote, traditional scholarly production, people might be interested in graduate school, law school, an MBA. If that is something that's on your radar, we also offer opportunities that are going to best prepare you to make really strong applications for a PhD, for an MBA, for a JD, and for med school even, for that matter. So if those are things that are on your radar, we have several research initiatives underway. The one I would especially like to highlight now is our annual participation in the undergraduate research workshop at the McNeil Center for Early American Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. And what that means is once a year, every year, a senior student at Iona, not a history major, I think, in fact, we've only had one history major go in the 5 years we've been participating in this program, where you workshop over the course of a semester at Penn and in the archives and libraries there, and with your own designated mentor, a piece of writing, either that's a digital humanities project or a traditional essay, and you present it at a 2-day conference where you meet friends from around the country. Globally now, it has in fact gone international, and students all convene in Philly, and you make contacts, you network, you have to go to a great conference. It's an absolutely fabulous program, and is looking to be one of the first of what will now be continuing collaborations with the McNeil Center as well. So that's something really great to look forward to. And more generally speaking, we also offer sort of community collaboration opportunities, appointments both for credit and for pay with our different ITPS public-facing events, author talks, social media, PR, promotion, marketing, event coordination, so many different facets of that kind of work. And of course, our different digital platforms, which are digital history outreach, which includes a podcast, a blog, a newsletter, and social media, and then of course the From the Vault campaigns. So these are just a few of the highlights to offer, and I think probably a good note for us to wrap up on. Michael, did you have anything else you wanted to share?
Yeah, I just wanted to say Thomas Paine says hello. This is from a statue we have. This is just the head that we have in our office. Let me get the angle right. This is from the 1920s, but Thomas wanted to say hello. So that's the last thing I have to say, but it's not really me, it's Thomas.
Well, there you have it. You can have the descended head of Thomas Paine greet you whenever you might like. On my part, I just want to again thank you, Mena, so much for the invitation, for the opportunity to share a bit about the ITPS and the public history work we do here. If anyone does have any further questions, please let us know. And thank you for the thank you for the conversation.
Well, thank you, Nora and Michael, for this very interesting talk. There were things about the ITPS that I didn't even know, so thank you very much for letting us know. I'm going to open the floor if somebody has questions, but well, people think I have a question. At the very beginning of the talk, you mentioned that there was some kind of association, if I remember correctly, correct me if I'm wrong, that Thomas Paine was also considered somehow like a social activist. Last 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago, there was a worldwide conference in Vienna about public history and social activism. And it seems that that trend is taking like a lot of, I mean, it's kind of trendy again. There were people from all over the world discussing that. I want to ask you, how does the ITPS stand about that kind of doing doing public history? For some people, like in other universities, I know it's kind of frowned upon. You're a scholar or an activist. You cannot be both. What does the ITPS think about that? ITPS.
Sure. Well, I can. So in other words, the sort of conversation at this conference was that you cannot be an activist and historian at the same time. In other words, that was the consensus. Well, I would say first and foremost that I just respectfully, not being sort of privy to that conversation, I don't think that's historical. I do not think that is historically grounded. I think above all else, we should be mindful of the fact that people throughout history wear multiple different hats and pursue multiple different paths in their labor and in their work. And from my impression is that many of our historical subjects did the same, and that historians need to choose the methods and the approaches that are most effective for their work. For some folks, that might be work that is very separate from contemporary experiences and contemporary work. And I think that is completely fine and perfectly ethical. For others, the stakes of their scholarship might be deeply entwined with contemporary realities. And it would be impossible for them to do that work, separating activism from their scholarship. And so I guess what I would say, personally, not speaking for the institution, but for myself, I think that people need to choose the best path for them and for their work. And we should have a pretty big tent, allowing people to pursue the kind of scholarly endeavors they want to do. And so long as there's transparency and clarity about how they're approaching their work, that's good with me, including activist historians.
Yeah, we can be both. That's what I think all the time. I mean,
that's a much more concise and direct way of putting it, but yes, I would agree. I think we can.
Why can't we both? I want to ask you about the reception of the public history and digital humanities minor. Have you received like a lot of questions, a lot of students, a lot of interest?
Yeah, so I think it's off to a great start. We have had several students enroll already, which is really exciting. I believe in the first year we had 6 students enroll, which was great. Iona is a smaller university, so that's a really terrific number. But I think we're definitely looking to expand interest and to get the word out. So we would love to have more students reaching out to us. Michael, I don't know if you either want to respond to Jimena's first question about activist history or the question about the reception of the minor.
I'll just respond to the first question by saying that I think I largely agree with you, Nora. It's never been, I say this as a scholar of Thomas Paine, who we would call an activist today. I think that's a fair term to describe him, but who was also intended to be the first historian of the American Revolution, a book that he never wrote, but which was published as a letter to the Abbé Raynal in 1782, before the end of the American Revolution. The man attempted to write a history of the American Revolution before it was finished, and I don't think that he saw any clear difference between scholarship and activism, and I'm not sure that I do either, but that's largely repeating what you both said, which is that why can't we do both? Why should they be separated from each other? And I'll just add to what you said for the second question, Nora. Not only we have, I think we've had 8 now people who are enrolled in the minor degree program, 3 of which have graduated with the minor degree. Mm-hmm. We were lucky to them as they were entering their junior and senior years, and they're on to bigger and better things, including a couple, and I won't name names, but who are who've secured internships at the Metropolitan Museum in New York City. I think we've all heard of the Metropolitan Museum, but that's very exciting for us that we're already seeing people graduate with a minor degree, which is one of the purposes behind it. Right? It's not a minor degree that's intended to suck up a tremendous amount of coursework in the form of many required classes. It's not that it's not rigorous, but that it's, for reasons that Nora talked about, we're just very proud that we already have minor degree graduates, and that's great.
Well, that's really awesome and really impressive. And there was another thing that I just wanted. It's not a question, but more than a comment, that you both mentioned that you would like also to encourage people who don't have a background in history to apply to the public history and digital humanities minor, or just to be involved in the public history field. And I want to take that opportunity to also talk about like the federation. From the federation, we're trying really hard to tell people that public history is not only about history. It's about like an approach to things, that you don't have to be a historian. And we're trying to reach to people that does work with arts, with production, with theater, like trying to go beyond history so people can understand more about like the public. So I think that what you're doing is I mean, it's really a good effort and a really good endeavor. And I think it's gonna, I mean, it sounds great. I'm gonna tell my students to go and figure that out like more. For like some of them declare students that have like an interest but are not so sure. Um, I guess they will find this very interesting.
Well, we hope so.
Yeah.
I believe so, truly.
Yeah,
Thank you.
yeah. And I think, I mean, public history, as you know, is like racing again, it's like trendy again, like everybody, well, not everybody, but a lot of people having like an interest in Latin America, where I come from. The practice of public history much more committed to political causes. It's also like gaining strength. That's my line of public history. So I find it like really interesting to find like some common ground with a character as Thomas Paine. So yeah, I don't know if anybody else has any question or any comment. Well, if nobody has any more questions or comments, the video, it will process and I will send you a copy, and I will also upload it to the page of the Federation and circulate it broadly with your permission. And I want to thank you again for accepting our invitation. This was really, really interesting, and I'm going to show it to my students actually in class.
Awesome.
Thank you so much, Jimena, and thank you again to the IFPH for having us. And again, it's really wonderful just to be in conversations. Again, that spirit of the big tent, right? Of having as many perspectives and approaches as possible. It's just really wonderful to be in conversation with folks who come from all over the world. So that's really wonderful. So thank you. Thank you for putting the ITPS out there for people to learn more about.
Well, thank you again, and thank you to the audience. And I'm going to stop recording now.